I want to spend some time now considering some of the issues associated with mental health in regards to supervision, and not just of mental health of students, but also mental health of staff members who are on supervisory teams. And I've experienced both of these, quite a lot of mental health issues with students and also some with staff that are involved in supervisions, and we'll discuss both of them. The first thing I want to talk about is the prevalence of mental health issues in HDR candidates. In society, I believe roughly 1 in 10 people suffer from some kind of mental health issue. So you can be guaranteed that experienced supervisors have had or do have HDR students that have mental health issues. One study of more than 3,600 PhD students in Belgium found that over a third of them were likely to develop or already have a psychiatric disorder, most frequently depression. At the moment, my average is somewhat higher. I currently co-supervise 7 PhD students. 2 have trauma, 1 suffers from anxiety, and 1 is bipolar. Supervisors are not immune from this either, so we'll deal with that later. But the reality is that supervisors are not mental health experts. So I'm not suggesting we become them. We are, however, obliged to be aware of the signs. We can't bury our head in the sand about it. And so it's in the spirit of that discussion that we need to be open about mental health issues, how they affect candidates and supervisors. It's interesting that one of the early warning signs that you do get of mental health issues, but it's by no means conclusive, is that there's a failure to communicate. So usually this is manifest in delaying or avoiding meetings, resistance to communication at all, or a succession of deferrals, sometimes accompanied with medical certificates. But typically it doesn't take long for people to tweak that there's an issue. There is very little information or research into mental health of HDR students, but thankfully this work is started by some of the peak bodies, particularly the United Kingdom Council of Graduate Education, the so-called UKCGE, and we'll look at some of their work later. While this work is very necessary, it is also really only at its beginning. The advice given does not take non-dominant cultures into account, and it doesn't talk about institutional variations or limitations. Our students come from a diverse range of communities and backgrounds, and this complicates things for everybody. Mental health issues refracted through cultural differences add to the complexity of detecting these issues in the first place and of finding effective strategies to assist HDR students. Here I have an example from my own work of a Saudi student who had a breakdown during their candidature. Luckily, his wife reported the incident to the student's co-supervisor, who happened to be female. It would have been inappropriate for the wife to communicate directly with me, but she knew that the co-supervisor and I got on well and that I could be quickly alerted to the situation and try to do something about it. So this is a interesting situation where a cultural difference and an understanding of a cultural difference on the part of the student's wife enabled an emergency situation to be conveyed to the entire supervisory team very quickly. There is, to some extent, institutional support for mental health issues. Supervisors need to be aware of this support. It's surprising how few supervisors actually know what exists. In part, this is due to the fact that the universities are reluctant to talk about the issue, but in part also it's a reluctance of supervisors to find out about it. There are examples of support people. Start with them. HDR coordinators are one, student advisors are another, accommodation officers as well. These often know when students are unwell. So one of my particular students who was living in university accommodation was not answering their door and appeared not to be present at meals and things like that. So it was an accommodation officer who first raised the alarm on the mental status of this particular student. There are also on-call mental health carers and private detectives I didn't realise this was the case until relatively recently in my own institution. So what advice I would give supervisors is go find out what's available. What services are available for students. So this is some of the work, reporting some of the work of the UK CGE on mental health of students. And their work was related to the stages of candidature, not surprisingly. So pre-registration, issue, early stages, mid stages and final stages of candidature. So let's run through this briefly. So the pre-registration challenges for students that have mental health issues include correctly managing expectations, choosing the right research group for the student, the right supervisor and environment for the student. On a personal basis, the student should feel free to disclose their mental health issues as much as it's possible for them to do so. And communications, sometimes the number of communications that flow from universities to students, particularly in a bureaucratic tone, are often challenging for those students. Sometimes those communications arrive too late as well, so timeliness is important. Some of the issues that affect mental health of students during early stages of their candidature include transition pressures. So when they're moving from undergraduate programs or from Master of Research programs into PhD programs. This provides additional pressures that students may become susceptible to. There's also the notion of an imposter syndrome, and this actually affects academics as well, so we'll talk about it later in some depth. Financial pressures, of course, the fact that students may not be, maybe overseas students and don't necessarily understand the culture that they've landed in. They may be very far away from their families. Mid-stage challenges include staying motivated, keeping up the momentum, particularly when there's no end in sight, building resilience and dealing with negative results. There may also be career prospect anxieties and also work-life balance issues. Some final stage challenges include financial pressures, a need to get jobs, for example. What next? How does the career outside of academia looks? There may be a void left by submission. So you've worked 3 or 6 years on this life-defining idea to hand it in, and then what? So students often suffer depression from this particular part of the process as well. The stress of writing up, corrections to the thesis, pressures to publish, and so on. There's plenty of reasons to have a mental health issue if you're a HDR student. I said I would talk about imposter syndromes, and my discussion here is from Clarke 2018. So imposter syndrome is defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. Imposters suffer from chronic self-doubt and a sense of intellectual fraudulence that overrides any feelings of success or external proof of their competence. High-achieving, highly successful people often suffer from imposter syndrome, and it doesn't equate to low self-esteem or lack of self-confidence. It's often a sign of perfectionism, and you find it in academics as much as you do HDR candidates. Another sign of mental health problems with HDR students, or indeed members of the HDR supervision team, is procrastination. This is basically a fear of failure, which then translates into a fear to act. So we can describe this kind of situation with what's called a causal loop diagram, which is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. This consists of 2 kinds of loops: a balancing loop, where an action, a cause, produces a consequence in the opposite way or in the opposite manner. So behaviour over time of this loop is that things tend to settle into an equilibrium. So we can imagine that a perceived problem, for example, writing some part of the dissertation, can itself be avoided by, or mitigated by, avoiding the problem. And this is a kind of fix, but it's a short-term fix. So over the short term, this balancing loop, as the stress of trying to get things done is felt by the student, but inaction is used as a fix, an avoidance strategy to actually do that work, there's a momentary release of the stress. So you can see that the avoidance strategy applied, the fix applied, reduces to an extent the perceived difficulty, but only in the short term. And in fact, actually what's going on is that today's problems, the perceived difficulties, come from yesterday's solutions. The avoidance strategy used is actually becoming the problem. And this is indicated by the blue reinforcing loop. So whilst a student may be getting some momentary relief by avoiding a problem, the reinforcing loop in blue is just increasing the problem. So the problems are being piled one on top of each other. Problems occur, get removed, appear once again with greater intensity, and the student is trapped into this connection between a balancing loop, a short-term balancing loop, and a longer-term reinforcing loop, which is making the problem worse. So how do you manage this problem as a supervisor? You get rid of or stop using the fix. So you basically try to arrange a situation where the students have less opportunity to avoid you by insisting on, for example, frequent meetings. That's one way of doing it. This whole idea of describing the dynamics of the supervisory process using causal loop diagrams is actually an interesting one and useful as a sort of a teaching example as much as anything else. One thing to consider is when you talk to supervisors, why would a supervisor knowingly take on a student with a mental health problem? And of course, mostly we don't know that the students have mental health problems, and sometimes the mental health problems develop during the HDR candidature. But sometimes these are pre-existing conditions. So why would a supervisor take on a HDR student with a mental health problem? Well, it's a very different answer depending on the kind of mental health problems and also the supervisors. If the mental health issue wasn't known before the candidate started, supervisors do feel some obligation towards students and they feel locked in. I have a bipolar student who is incredibly bright. Her supervising team knows that when they get 2 healthy months of her, she will produce an outstanding piece of work. The other thing is that we admire her. That's the other thing. Seeing people work through these issues while they're doing some of the most demanding intellectual work is something to be looked at and to understand how amazing that is. So sometimes the students can be inspirational, I would say. Now, the other reason why we might take on HDR students is because of their previous experience with other supervisors when it's not worked well. So 2 of my students with anxiety, depression and PTSD got that way in part due to a toxic supervisor that they had previously. And so their current team is wanting to actually get these students through the program as an example of the fact that not all supervisors are toxic. It is something to be successful in part as a consequence of showing a good example. Now, when it comes to mental health issues for supervisors, this is also a very demanding and challenging area. When students suffer from mental health issues, it's generally just their candidature that suffers. Sometimes it is in part supervisors' well-being as well. But it's a much greater problem institutionally when supervisors have mental health issues, and potentially many students can suffer from this. I have an overseas experience of this directly. My research director at a former university suddenly retired due to mental health issues, and I was required to solve this problem. He had 13 PhD students, and I already had a full complement of PhD students, and many of these PhD students from the research director had not been supervised in a very long while. And I was forced into a situation of trying to figure out which students were salvageable. And so I had to perform a triage on them. And that meant identifying who could continue and be successful without my direct heavy involvement in their supervisions. Some of them were quite well advanced. Others were in no state to continue. So they had to be exited somehow out of the system. And it's the ones that were in the middle that could be salvaged, had reasonable projects. Those were the ones that we needed to spend the time on. So this term triage comes from trier in French, which means to sort. And so really I needed to sort these students into ones who were viable and ones who were not. Then once we had figured out the students that really did need the interventions in order to complete, then we used a concept from the space program called a Tiger team, which is used for tracking down and fixing fast a problem when it is evident. And so we borrowed this concept of a Tiger team and applied it to supervision. And so to try and get the students that were seriously impacted through their program.